and it is quite unlike ordinary anxiety. It is not the anxiety about paying bills or maintaining relationships or achieving goals. It is not the worry about health or reputation or security. It is something far more fundamental, far more disorienting, far more existentially unsettling. And if you are experiencing this particular anxiety, if you find yourself in the grip of this specific kind of disturbance, it is important that you understand what it actually is. Because what feels like something going terribly wrong may in fact be the sign that something is going profoundly right. This anxiety that comes before awakening is the feeling that arises when your entire worldview is beginning to crack, when the foundations upon which you have built your understanding of reality are starting to crumble. When the story you have been telling yourself about who you are and what life is begins to reveal itself as just that, a story, a construction, a fiction that you have been taking for absolute truth. Let me describe this more carefully, because it is essential that you recognize this experience if you are going through it. This is not garden variety worry or stress. This is an existential vertigo, a sense that the ground beneath your feet is dissolving, that nothing you thought was solid is actually solid, that everything you have relied upon to make sense of your experience is failing, falling away, proving inadequate to contain or explain what is actually happening. You may feel as though you are going mad. You may feel as though you have lost your grip on reality. You may feel as though you are falling through space with nothing to hold on to, nothing to orient yourself by, nothing to tell you which way is up or down. The old certainties no longer hold. The familiar landmarks have disappeared. The map you have been using to navigate your life no longer corresponds to the territory you find yourself in. And the terrible thing is that you cannot go back. You cannot return to the comfortable ignorance you once had. You have seen something, realized something, understood something that has made it impossible to believe in the old way anymore. But you have not yet fully arrived in the new way. You are between worlds, between stories, between identities, and this in-between place, this liminal space, this dark night of the soul, this is where the anxiety arises. Now, why does this happen? What causes this particular form of distress? To understand this, we must understand what awakening actually is. Awakening is not, as many people imagine, the acquisition of new knowledge or new powers or new states of consciousness. Awakening is the falling away of illusion, the seeing through of falsehood, the recognition of what has always been true but was obscured by layers of conditioning and belief and interpretation. And the primary illusion that must fall away, the fundamental falsehood that must be seen through, is the sense of being a separate, isolated, autonomous self, an independent entity existing somehow apart from and over against the rest of reality. This sense of being a separate self is so deeply ingrained, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of your experience, that when it begins to loosen, when it starts to dissolve, the effect is nothing short of catastrophic to your ordinary sense of identity. You see, your entire life has been organized around this separate self. Every goal you have pursued has been in service of protecting, enhancing, or gratifying this self. Every fear you have felt has been fear for this self. Every desire has been desire of this self. Every memory, every hope, every plan has been structured around the assumption that you are this separate entity, moving through time and space, trying to survive, trying to thrive, trying to secure your existence. And now, through spiritual practice, or through life circumstances, or through some combination of both, this fundamental assumption is being challenged. You are beginning to see that the separate self you have taken yourself to be is not what you thought it was. It is not solid, not permanent, not independently existing. It is more like a process than a thing, more like a pattern than an entity, more like a verb than a noun. It is something that is happening rather than something that is. But you are not yet fully established in this new understanding. You have glimpsed it, perhaps, or sensed it, or had moments where it was clear. But most of the time, you still experience yourself in the old way as a separate self. Except now there is a crack in the structure, a fault line in the foundation. You can no longer fully believe in the separate self, but you cannot yet fully let go of it either. And this creates a kind of psychological earthquake, a shaking of the very ground of your being. The anxiety that arises from this is unlike anything else you have experienced. It is not about any particular thing going wrong. It is about everything you have taken for granted being called into question. It is the anxiety of losing your reference points, your coordinates, your sense of who and what you are. It is the fear of dissolution, of disappearing, of ceasing to exist, not physically, but as the particular you that you have always known yourself to be. Let me give you some specific examples of how this anxiety manifests, so that you can recognize it if you are experiencing it. You may find that activities and pursuits that once gave you meaning and purpose now feel empty and pointless. The career you were building, the relationships you were cultivating, the goals you were pursuing, they suddenly seem hollow, as though you have been investing enormous energy in things that do not actually matter. But you have not yet found what does matter, what could replace these things, what could give your life direction and purpose if these old structures fall away. You may find that you can no longer relate to people in the way you once did. Conversations that used to engage you now seem superficial, meaningless, like people talking in their sleep about dreams they believe to be real. You see through the social games, the personas, the performances, and you can no longer fully participate in them with the innocence you once had. But this leaves you isolated, alienated, unable to connect with others in the old way, but not yet able to connect with them in some new way. You may find that you cannot take seriously the things that everyone else takes seriously. The concerns that occupy most people, getting ahead, making money, achieving status, maintaining appearances, they seem absurd to you. Like children arguing about the rules of a game, that is itself arbitrary and meaningless. But you are still living in the world where these things matter, where you must participate in these games to some degree, and so you feel a kind of split, a division between what you see and what you must do. You may experience moments of what feels like depersonalization or derealization, where you feel disconnected from your own experience, where life seems dreamlike or unreal, where you feel like you are watching yourself from the outside rather than being yourself from the inside. These moments can be profoundly disturbing because they challenge the basic sense of being a solid, real person having real experiences in a real world. You may have sudden attacks of existential terror, moments where you are overwhelmed by questions like, what am I? What is this? What is existence? Why is there something rather than nothing? These are not intellectual questions you are pondering leisurely. They are urgent, pressing, overwhelming questions that arise with a force that can be almost unbearable. You feel as though you are staring into an abyss, confronting the fundamental mystery and strangeness of existence itself. You may feel as though you are losing your mind, as though you are going crazy, as though something is deeply wrong with you that no one else seems to experience or understand. You may feel terribly alone, as though you are the only one going through this, as though no one could possibly understand what you are experiencing. And this isolation intensifies the anxiety, makes it even more difficult to bear. Now, here is what you must understand if you are going through this. What you are experiencing is not pathology. It is not mental illness. It is not something wrong with you. It is the natural and necessary process of awakening. The structure of the separate self is dissolving. And this dissolution feels like death because, in a very real sense, it is death, the death of the illusion that you were this separate entity, the death of the fiction that you were independent and autonomous and isolated from the rest of reality. But it is only the death of what was never true to begin with. What you actually are, what you have always been, cannot die because it was never born. What you are beyond the separate self, what you are at the deepest level, is the consciousness itself, the awareness in which all experience appears, the ground of being that cannot be threatened or diminished or destroyed, because it is not a thing that exists, it is the isness in which all things exist. But you cannot know this conceptually, cannot understand it intellectually, cannot grasp it with the thinking mind. You can only realize it through direct experience, through a kind of radical letting go, through allowing the separate self to dissolve completely and discovering what remains when it has dissolved. And this letting go, this dissolution, this death of the illusory self, this is what the anxiety is preparing you for. The anxiety is actually serving a purpose, though it does not feel like it when you are in the midst of it. The anxiety is pushing you to let go, to surrender, to stop trying to maintain the fiction of the separate self. As long as you had the luxury of believing in the separate self, of experiencing yourself as this isolated entity, you could continue in that illusion indefinitely. But now that illusion is cracking, and the anxiety is making it impossible to remain comfortable in it. The anxiety is creating a crisis that will force a resolution, that will compel you to either fall back into deeper illusion or to leap forward into awakening. This is why spiritual traditions speak of the dark night of the soul, of the narrow gate, of the eye of the needle, of the death that must occur before rebirth. They are all pointing to this same process, this same passage, this same necessary dissolution of the false self that must happen if the true nature is to be realized. And they all acknowledge that this passage is difficult, that it involves suffering, that it can feel like madness or death or disintegration. But they also assure you that this passage is navigable, that others have gone through it before you, that there is something on the other side of this anxiety, something worth all the difficulty and terror of the passage. And that something is freedom, freedom from the tyranny of the separate self, freedom from the constant need to defend and promote and gratify this illusory entity, freedom from the fear that has shadowed your entire existence. Because as long as you believe you are a separate self, you are vulnerable, threatened, always potentially at risk. So what do you do when you find yourself in this state? How do you navigate this anxiety that comes before awakening? The first and most important thing is to recognize it for what it is. Do not pathologize it. Do not treat it as though something is wrong with you. Understand that you are in a process of transformation, that the old structures are falling away to make room for something new, that what feels like disintegration is actually a kind of reorganization at a higher level of complexity. The second thing is to not fight it. Do not resist the process. Do not try to go back to the old way of experiencing yourself, because you cannot. The genie is out of the bottle. You have seen what you have seen, and you cannot unsee it. Trying to maintain the separate self, when you have already begun to see through it, will only increase the suffering, will only prolong the agony of this transition. Instead, allow the process to unfold. Allow the uncertainty, allow the not knowing, allow the dissolution of the old structures without immediately trying to replace them with new structures. Be willing to be in the void, in the emptiness, in the space between stories, without rushing to fill it with a new story. This is extraordinarily difficult, because the mind hates emptiness, hates uncertainty, hates not knowing. But this emptiness is precisely what is needed. This is the space in which transformation can occur. The third thing is to find support if you can. This might mean connecting with others who have gone through this process, or working with a teacher who understands these stages of awakening, or reading accounts by mystics and contemplatives who have described this dark night. Knowing that you are not alone, that this is a recognized and understood process, that others have survived it and emerged, transformed, this can be enormously helpful when you are in the midst of the anxiety and confusion. The fourth thing is to maintain basic practices that keep you grounded. Meditation, if you have been practicing, should continue even if it becomes difficult or uncomfortable. Physical exercise can help keep you in your body when you feel like you are floating away into abstraction. Time in nature can provide a kind of silent support and perspective that human interaction often cannot. Simple routines and structures can provide some stability when your inner world feels chaotic. But perhaps most importantly, you must cultivate trust. Trust that this process is unfolding as it needs to unfold. Trust that the anxiety, as uncomfortable as it is serving a purpose. Trust that you are being carried by something larger than your individual will or understanding. Trust that life knows what it is doing, that consciousness knows how to awaken to itself, that you do not need to figure this out or manage it or control it. You simply need to allow it, to surrender to it, to let it happen. This trust is not blind faith. It is not believing something on authority. It is more like the trust a seed might have in the process of its own germination, if a seed could be conscious of the process. The seed must dissolve its old form in order to become the plant. The chrysalis must break down into something like mush before the butterfly can emerge. And you, in this process of awakening, must allow the dissolution of the separate self before your true nature can be fully realized and embodied. The anxiety you are experiencing is the resistance to this dissolution. Part of you knows that letting go completely would mean the end of you as you have known yourself. And that part is fighting for its survival, is generating anxiety as a way of saying, don't let go, hold on, this is dangerous, you will cease to exist. But this is the voice of the illusion itself, the separate self, trying to maintain itself, trying to prevent its own dissolution. What you must come to see is that what you will lose is only what was false to begin with. What you will lose is the fiction of separation, the illusion of isolation, the belief that you are fundamentally disconnected from the rest of existence. And what you will gain, or rather, what you will discover you already are, is far more vast, far more profound, far more fundamentally secure than the separate self could ever be. You will discover that you are not a wave separate from the ocean, but the ocean itself appearing as a wave. You are not a leaf separate from the tree, but the tree itself expressing as a leaf. You are not a being in the universe, but the universe expressing itself as this particular being. And this recognition, when it comes not as a concept, but as a direct realization, dissolves the anxiety at its root. Because the anxiety of the separate self is always the anxiety of vulnerability, of potential loss, of the threat of non-existence. But when you realize that what you actually are cannot be threatened, cannot be lost, was never born and will never die, the ground of anxiety is removed. There may still be appropriate responses to danger, natural self-preservation in the face of genuine threats. But the chronic existential anxiety, the background dread that has shadowed your entire existence as a separate self, this falls away. And what remains is a kind of peace that has nothing to do with circumstances, a peace that persists whether things are going well or going poorly, whether you are comfortable or uncomfortable, whether you are succeeding or failing by conventional measures. It is the peace of recognizing what you actually are, of being established in your true nature, rather than in the fiction of the separate self. But to get to this peace, to arrive at this recognition, you must pass through the anxiety. You must endure the dark night. You must allow the death of the false self. And this is not easy. This is not comfortable. This is not what the separate self wants or would choose if it had the choice. But here is the beautiful and terrible truth. You do not have the choice. If you have begun to awaken, if the process has started, you cannot stop it. You can delay it, resist it, make it more difficult than it needs to be, but you cannot ultimately prevent it. Something in you has turned toward truth, toward reality, toward what is actually the case beyond all illusions. And once this turning has occurred, the process will continue until completion, until the illusion has been fully seen through and the truth has been fully realized. The anxiety you feel is actually the birth pang of this new recognition. It is the labor of awakening. And just as physical labor is painful but necessary for birth, this psychological and spiritual labor is painful but necessary for the birth of your true nature into conscious recognition. You are being born into what you have always been. You are awakening to what has always been true. You are recognizing what was never actually hidden, but which you were too identified with the separate self to see. So if you find yourself in this anxiety, if you recognize this description as matching your experience, know that you are not going crazy. You are not falling apart. You are not losing yourself. You are losing the illusion of yourself, the false construction of who you thought you were. And though this feels like death, it is actually the precondition for truly living, for being fully awake, for recognizing what and who you actually are beyond all the stories and concepts and identifications. Be patient with yourself. Be gentle with yourself. This is one of the most difficult passages a human being can go through. But it is also one of the most important, one of the most transformative, one of the most ultimately liberating. On the other side of this anxiety, on the other side of this dark night, there is a dawn that you cannot yet imagine. There is a freedom you cannot yet conceive. There is a peace that passes all understanding because it is not based on circumstances or beliefs, but on the direct recognition of your own true nature. The anxiety that comes before awakening is the storm before the calm, the death before the rebirth, the darkness before the dawn. Trust the process. Allow the dissolution. Let go of what was never true. And discover what has always been real